Okay, we're going to be talking about Ember Data. It's not just for JSON API anymore. And as the title makes it seem, it's for using Ember Data with APIs that don't conform nicely to JSON API. So if you don't know me, I was introduced, I guess, but I'm Robbie Wagner. You've probably seen me around Slack and Discord and GitHub and NPM and all the things as RW Wagner 90. I run ShipShape, which is a Ember consultancy, and so if you ever need any help with your Ember apps or just want to talk Ember or anything, I'm always around, always happy to talk with you guys. You may have seen some of the add-ons that we maintain, like Ember Math Helpers is one of the more popular ones. Ember Shepherd and Shepherd JS do site tour stuff, so it makes it easy to do site tours for your site. And I've been working on Ember Inspector a good bit recently, so we always need help with that. So if you're interested in that, let me know. So who here has used Ember Data before? Okay, most people. So if you've used Ember, you've probably used Ember Data at some point, but just in case you have no idea what Ember Data is, I took this handy description from their README. And it says, Ember Data is a library for robustly managing data in applications built with Ember.js. It's designed to be agnostic to the underlying persistence mechanism, so it works just as well with JSON API over HTTP as it does with streaming WebSockets or local IndexedDB storage. So this is technically a true description, but if you're not using JSON API or some good REST standards, you're probably going to have a lot of things you need to customize, and your life is not going to be as easy as if you had conformed to one of those. So what is JSON API then? Well, got another really handy description, a specification for building APIs in JSON. So that's not super descriptive, but it's kind of a nice standard that incorporates things like links and relationships for pagination, side loading included data, all these nice things you would expect when you hook all your models together and have them just kind of work. And Yehuda has been very involved in both JSON API and Ember, so it kind of makes sense that it's the de facto standard for Ember Data. But why do we care, right? Because if you were like me before I did all this customization stuff, all you need is a model. Like, you don't need any customization, it just works, right? Well, this is true if your backend developers have done a really good job of conforming to JSON API, and all of your adapters and serializers kind of just work, and you don't need to do the customization. But it's often not that clean. So what if your API is non-standard? So I had a need that kind of sparked this talk at Netflix on the project I was working on, that we had an old API that did use JSON API, and all the models and serializers were nicely conformed to that, but then the API was changing to a new API, and it didn't fit that box, but we still wanted to nicely use Ember Data with these new APIs, so we had to do customization to make it feel like it was the same interactions. So I spent a bunch of months doing customizations for all this stuff, talked to Runspired a lot, and David Tang, both of them helped me a ton with Ember Data and all this stuff. And David's got a lot of good blog posts you should read. I also wrote some blog posts to follow up on these blog posts. So check out shipshape.io, and you can see the blog posts there if you want to hear more info. So we're going to cover a few things. First, just the basic adapters versus serializers. What are they? What's the difference? Which should I use when? We'll talk a little bit about handling errors gracefully, and we'll do a specific example of doing a find or create type functionality when your API 404s. We'll talk about some custom normalization and serialization, and talk about manually forcing links and relationships and that sort of thing to make it seem like Ember Data is getting a nice JSON API format. And we'll talk about some of the common hooks and methods that exist for serializers and adapters, and which you should use when, and when they're called, when they're not, that sort of thing. So first, we have adapters and serializers. And I wanted to come up with some real-world examples for how to remember which is which. So who here has one of the new MacBooks with just USB-C ports? Yeah? So you're probably familiar with dongles and adapters and how they let you plug your computer into everything that already exists. So that's kind of what the adapter is in Ember Data. It just lets you hook up to your API, tells you where it is, the namespace, the host, how to talk to it, that kind of thing. But it doesn't really change the data itself. And on the flip side, a serializer is like this pasta maker. So it takes in dough on one side, and it outputs this usable pasta in the format you would want to eat later. So a serializer does that with your data, and it takes it in, and you can change it to look like JSON API for Ember Data, and then change it back to whatever format your backend might need. So adapters, as I mentioned briefly, do things like let you customize the host, namespace, path, etc. All the things you need to ensure you're hitting the correct endpoint for the model. And they have async capabilities where serializers do not. So if you want to make a few calls and make sure they're done before you return the data and combine them into one response, this is a good place to do it. So here's an example adapter. And typically, if you have a somewhat similar backend for all of your endpoints, you might want to have an application adapter and do some stuff there. So we're extending that here, assuming that is the case. And we changed the namespace because maybe you had a different API before, and now you've got v1, so you changed that. And we're using find belongs to hook to combine some requests, like I mentioned. So we go in and do another find record and add that to the response before returning it. So that lets us do multiple calls and combine it into one nice response. Serializers are used to massage the data responses sent to you from the API and to send it back as well. And there's several hooks available that run at different times and different situations that let you do exactly what you want with the data. And it can use things like embedded records mix-in. So if you have several models that are all included in one response and you want to say they're all embedded records, you can. So here's an example serializer, and for this one we're using the JSON serializer. We're including the embedded records mix-in and saying the bar relationship is always embedded. So whenever you get your response for this back, it's saying there's going to be a relationship of bar and it's always going to be included. You don't need to do extra requests for it, it's just there. And then in the serialize hook, we're doing a few things to massage the data. You can't really see exactly what's happening, but if you imagine there's a remove empty bar records method, and it takes in the record and the serialized data and removes some records, and then we delete a random BAS property as well. So we're changing things from the serialized data to conform to what we want before returning it back. So now we're going to talk a little bit about handling errors gracefully and the specific case of doing a find or create type of thing with belongs to. So if you use JSON API and you do a request for a collection and there are no records for it, it would typically give you a 200 and an empty response, which is good because your app gets to keep functioning. But if you have a different API, it might give you a 404 because there's nothing there. And that's going to cause your app to enter an error state, which is not good because you want your user to be able to still use your app. So if you want to catch that and keep the app going, you can use find belongs to, and you can ensure when it loads the belongs to relationship, it's going to create a default record instead of 404ing and give you that back so that you can keep using the app. And for this example, we'll use a person address relationship and see how we would accomplish that. So the person model is pretty simple. It just has an address relationship, and it's async true, so it's going to be loaded automatically for you. And on the flip side, the address model has things you would expect from an address, like line 1, line 2, city, state, zip, etc. And it has the inverse relationship to the person model. But then the magic happens in the person adapter. You have this find belongs to hook here, and we're just doing the base find belongs to functionality first with super, and then saying if that has an error, we want to catch it. So we're going to check if the relationship key was address, make sure it's the one we actually want to handle, and that the status was 404. So in that case, we return this empty address object basically with nulls for all the fields. And if it's not that specific case, we'll still throw the error because it's probably a real error. But this is going to allow you to have all of these fields on your model and change the things in the UI and save it and have them just save and no 404s or errors and everything's good to go. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some custom normalization and serialization. And for this example, we have some ad hoc relationships we're going to add, and we're going to use a website page view stats relationship. So imagine you have a website with multiple pages on your website, and each page has its view stats. We're going to get all of these back from a non-standard REST endpoint, though, for the whole website, not on a per page basis. So we have this API v3 websites, website ID, page view stats. And when we do a call to that, we're going to get all of the data for all the page view stats for the website. But we want to be able to access these on each page. So we're going to do some manual stuff to link it up to where each page knows what its page view stats are. So when we're iterating through pages, we can keep track of that and use each of those values. So we have a website model, which basically just has the has many for all the page view stats that it's going to load at the beginning. And then we have a serializer for the website model. And since our URL didn't conform to the REST standards that are expected by Ember Data, we needed to manually add the links in so that when you load it, it gets pulled down for you. So we're doing this with normalized find all response and normalized find record response. And we could have probably combined these into one just normalized response, but if you keep them separate and you need to do anything different based on the single versus multiple records case, you can. And we're going through and just adding this URL for page view stats as a link. But because we're not using the page view stats from the website directly, we need to manually load this. So in our model hook where we're finding the website, we're going to also get that has many and call .load on it so that it will load all the page view stats and then return the website including those page view stats. So then, now that we have all the page view stats, we need to define a relationship on the page so that it can access its own stats. So we have a page view stats belongs to, that's async false, and then on the page view stat model we have the inverse to the page. So then we need to manually set up the relationship. So in our page view stat serializer, we go in and say in the normalized response, if the request type is find has many, we're going to go through and for each of the page relationships, we're going to set that to the resource ID. So the page view stat will know what its parent page is, and you can access the page view stats from page.pageviewstats. And this kind of gives you the best of both worlds because you can do the one request to get everything for the whole website and reduce your number of API requests, but you can also access everything on each individual page level. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the common hooks and methods, which you've seen some of already. So for the base adapter, you have things like create record, delete record, and update record. And these do things you would expect, like create, update, and delete records. And you have things like find all and find record, which are the methods that will get called when you're querying for these records. So if you need to tweak some of the functionality when you're doing the query, this might be a good place to put that. So one common case that I had to do as well was if your API doesn't do put and patch, but you're updating a record, update record is typically going to force that method to be used. So we wanted to use post in all cases. So here we have this adapter which has create record and update record method, and they both call this create or update record method, which does the normal serialization and then just basically manually uses Ember Ajax to call post so that all of the calls will be a post call. So the base serializer doesn't have a ton of methods. The basic things you would have would be normalized response, which is used to normalize the payload from the server into something JSON API compliant for Ember Data to use. But the caveat here is it's only executed when you're doing a call for that specific resource type. So if you've done some of the things we did earlier where you're kind of forcing relationships in, you may need to do this on the parent record versus doing it on the child records. And on the flip side, serialize is used when you're sending the data back to the server to make everything compliant with the format the server expects. And I like to think of serialize and server both start with S, so that's a good way to remember what serialize is doing. So there are also some specific serializers that extend on the base serializer functionality. There's the JSON one, the REST one, and JSON API one. And they have things like normalize find all response and normalize find record response. And these are going to be your specific normalization calls where it's for a single record or a multiple record, like we saw in some of the examples earlier. And you're going to have a similar thing with serialize. So if you want to do things only in the belongs to case, you have it in serialize belongs to, or if you have multiple records, you use serialize has many. And there's another method called extract relationship. And this can be used to change the relationship type. So if your model exists from an old API and a new API is giving you back that same data, but they've changed the name on you, it's a good way to change the name on your side so that it can all just work. So this is what I mentioned about the different normalized find all response and normalized find record response. These are just ways to do the same sort of functionality but on the multiple records or single record case. And this is an example of how you would do the relationship name changing. So here we have imagine you have something with a polymorphic foo relationship, and this can be either a bar or BAS model in Ember Data. And this is the models you had before, but then your API changed things on you, and now you have A and B are the types. So we're going into extract relationship, and if it's that relationship, we know we want to check for the types, see if it's A or B, and then go in and say, if it is A, we want to use bar, otherwise we want to use BAS. And then you do kind of the opposite thing in the serialize belongs to, where you have if the key is foo, you do the normal belongs to record, but then you switch the type based on whether it was bar or BAS in Ember Data to either A or B for the backend. So there's a ton of serializer methods you can use. We didn't go over all of them, but you can pretty much do anything you want to customize pretty much everything. You can do keys for relationships, model names, etc. You can pretty much handle all the cases you could possibly have with a non-compliant API. And that's about it. Thanks. If you want more info, shipshape.io has blogs, or you can ask me some questions now. We've got some extra time. Yeah, I guess possibly. I think you can kind of handle everything. It's just more and more manual work the further you are away from some sort of usable spec, I think. Oh, sorry. The question was, are there cases where an adapter could not handle an API and it just wouldn't work at all. Sure. So the question was, we had a page view and page with a belongs to each other. So why aren't they circular was the question, I guess. So one was async, I think, and one wasn't, maybe? Okay, so they don't get loaded automatically then. So you probably wouldn't need it to be both ways, but yeah, if it's async false, it's not going to load itself, so it's okay. I can try. The question is, what was this snapshot? I think it's just kind of like all of the data for that record. I don't exactly know off the top of my head. Yeah, you could. So the question was, can you have custom methods in an adapter? And yeah, you could have whatever methods you want, really, but you would have to call them from one of the predefined ones so it would know when to call them. So you could have like some functions you abstract functionality out into and then call them from the main hooks. Yep, sure. So the question was, how do you deal with something that's like user/user ID/ something else / some other ID? And so there's a couple ways you can do that. We kind of briefly touched on doing that in the links, so you can put your non-standard URL in the links manually and fill in each of the IDs. So it would call to that, but whoops. So it would call to that, but then pull the data in for the relationship you expect. You can also, there's an add-on like Ember Data URL templates or something like that. You can define the template for that. So you could say the URL is going to be user/ID/other thing/ID in the adapter for that model, and it'll just know, like hooks it up behind the scenes for you. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, I guess I'm done.